In the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, where power and principle dance their eternal waltz, there exists a truth that few dare to acknowledge: the most dangerous leaders are not those who lack convictions, but those whose convictions blind them to reality itself. This paradox, woven into the very fabric of political existence, reveals itself through the lens of Niccolò Machiavelli's penetrating observations on human nature and the exercise of power. The Florentine secretary understood, perhaps better than any political theorist before or since, that the relationship between moral certainty and effective governance is far more complex than the simple narratives of virtue and vice would suggest. In his careful study of princes, republics, and the mechanics of statecraft, Machiavelli uncovered a disturbing pattern: those who hold their beliefs with the greatest fervor often become the architects of their own destruction, while those around them suffer the consequences of their unwavering certainty. Consider the case of Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar whose moral crusade consumed Florence in the 1490s. Savonarola possessed convictions of such intensity that they seemed to burn with divine fire. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was God's instrument for purifying a corrupt world. His certainty was absolute, his vision crystal clear, and his dedication unwavering. Yet these very qualities, which his followers mistook for strengths, became the instruments of his downfall and brought chaos to the city he sought to save. Machiavelli witnessed firsthand how Savonarola's blind conviction led him to reject any counsel that contradicted his divine mission. When Pope Alexander VI commanded him to cease his inflammatory preaching, Savonarola's certainty prevented him from recognizing the political reality of his situation. When the Florentine elite grew weary of his moral hectoring, his convictions blinded him to the shifting tides of popular opinion. When evidence mounted that his prophecies were failing to materialize, his unwavering faith prevented him from adapting his approach. In the end, the very people who had once hailed him as a prophet dragged him to the stake, and Florence was left to rebuild from the ashes of his moral certainty. This pattern repeats itself throughout history with depressing regularity. The most catastrophic political failures often emerge not from the machinations of the cynically ambitious, but from the uncompromising pursuit of noble ideals by those who have lost the capacity for self-doubt. The conviction that one possesses absolute truth becomes a form of political blindness that renders leaders incapable of perceiving the world as it actually exists, rather than as they believe it should exist. Machiavelli's genius lay in recognizing that this blindness stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of political action itself. Politics, in his view, operates according to its own logic, which often conflicts with the logic of moral philosophy or religious conviction. The political actor who attempts to impose a rigid moral framework upon the fluid realities of power inevitably finds himself crushed between the immovable object of his principles and the irresistible force of circumstance. The surprising consequence of this dynamic is that those who begin with the noblest intentions often end up causing the greatest harm. The leader who refuses to compromise his principles may find himself unable to govern effectively, leading to the very outcomes he sought to prevent. The reformer who will not bend may break entirely, leaving his cause in ruins. The prophet who demands immediate perfection may destroy the possibility of gradual improvement. Yet Machiavelli's analysis reveals an even more subtle and disturbing truth: blind convictions are not merely personally destructive, but systematically corrupting. They create environments in which truth itself becomes subordinated to belief, where evidence is filtered through the lens of predetermined conclusions, and where dissent is treated as betrayal rather than wisdom. In such environments, the very mechanisms that might correct course become inoperable, creating a feedback loop that amplifies error and accelerates destruction. The first part of this analysis must therefore examine the psychological and philosophical roots of blind conviction, tracing how noble intentions can transform into dangerous certainties. It requires us to understand how the human need for meaning and purpose, when coupled with the intoxicating sense of righteousness that comes from holding strong beliefs, can override the critical faculties that are essential for effective leadership. When a leader becomes convinced that he possesses unique insight into truth or justice, he begins to operate under a different set of rules than those around him. His convictions become not merely personal beliefs, but cosmic imperatives that justify any means necessary for their realization. This transformation is often gradual and imperceptible, masked by the language of virtue and the appearance of moral consistency. The leader continues to speak of serving others, of pursuing the common good, of upholding sacred principles, but these noble words increasingly serve to rationalize actions that would otherwise appear cruel or destructive. Machiavelli observed this phenomenon in countless historical examples, from the religious zealots who burned heretics to save their souls, to the revolutionary idealists who guillotined thousands in the name of liberty and equality. In each case, the actor's absolute certainty in the righteousness of his cause created a moral blind spot that rendered him incapable of recognizing the contradictions between his methods and his stated goals. The mechanism by which this transformation occurs is both subtle and powerful. It begins with the natural human tendency to seek confirmation for our existing beliefs while avoiding information that challenges them. When this tendency is reinforced by the echo chamber of like-minded supporters and the intoxicating effects of power, it can create a complete disconnect from reality. The leader begins to interpret all events through the lens of his predetermined narrative, seeing opposition as evidence of the corruption he seeks to combat, and setbacks as tests of his resolve rather than signals to reconsider his approach. This dynamic is particularly dangerous in political contexts because it feeds upon itself. The more resistance the leader encounters, the more convinced he becomes of the righteousness of his cause. The more his methods alienate potential allies, the more he sees evidence of the fundamental corruption of those around him. The more his policies fail to achieve their intended results, the more he becomes convinced that even more extreme measures are necessary. Each failure becomes proof not of the flaws in his approach, but of the magnitude of the forces arrayed against him. Machiavelli understood that this pattern was not merely a personal failing of individual leaders, but a structural feature of political life itself. The very nature of political action creates incentives for this kind of self-reinforcing certainty. Political leaders must project confidence to maintain authority, they must simplify complex issues to communicate with masses of people, and they must maintain consistency to preserve credibility. These requirements, while necessary for effective leadership, also create powerful pressures toward the kind of rigid thinking that Machiavelli identified as so dangerous. The tragedy of blind conviction is that it often begins with genuine insight and legitimate grievances. Savonarola was not wrong to see corruption in the church and society of his time. Revolutionary leaders are often correct in their identification of real injustices and systemic problems. The error lies not in the initial perception of problems, but in the conviction that one possesses complete understanding of both the nature of these problems and the means by which they can be solved. This conviction creates what modern psychologists might recognize as a form of cognitive closure, where the leader's mind becomes closed to new information that might complicate his understanding or require him to modify his approach. The complexity and ambiguity that characterize all real-world political situations become simplified into stark moral dramas in which the leader plays the role of the righteous hero battling forces of evil and corruption. The consequences of this simplification extend far beyond the leader himself. When a political movement becomes organized around the unquestionable convictions of its leader, it creates a culture in which questioning those convictions becomes tantamount to betrayal. Followers are encouraged to demonstrate their loyalty through the intensity of their belief rather than the quality of their thinking. Critical thinking is replaced by faithful repetition of approved doctrines, and intellectual honesty is sacrificed to ideological purity. In such environments, the natural corrective mechanisms that might prevent catastrophic errors become inoperable. Advisors learn to tell the leader what he wants to hear rather than what he needs to know. Information is filtered and distorted to conform to pre-existing beliefs. Alternative perspectives are dismissed without serious consideration. The leader becomes increasingly isolated within a bubble of his own making, surrounded by people who reinforce his convictions while shielding him from inconvenient realities. Machiavelli's analysis suggests that this dynamic is not merely an unfortunate byproduct of political life, but an inherent danger that must be actively resisted through conscious effort and institutional design. The wise leader, in his view, must cultivate what he called flexibility or adaptability, the ability to modify his approach as circumstances change, even when such modifications require him to act in ways that contradict his previous statements or apparent principles. This flexibility is not moral relativism or opportunistic cynicism, as Machiavelli's critics have often suggested. Rather, it represents a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between means and ends in political action. The leader who truly seeks to achieve good outcomes must be willing to employ whatever means the situation requires, even when those means conflict with abstract moral principles. The alternative, rigid adherence to principle regardless of consequences, often results in the destruction of both the leader and the very values he sought to protect. The challenge, of course, lies in distinguishing between legitimate adaptability and mere self-interested opportunism. Machiavelli was acutely aware of this difficulty, and much of his political writing can be understood as an attempt to provide guidance for leaders who must navigate this treacherous terrain. His answer lay in maintaining a clear focus on concrete outcomes rather than abstract principles, and in developing the judgment necessary to recognize when circumstances require a change in approach. This emphasis on practical wisdom rather than theoretical knowledge reflects Machiavelli's deeper understanding of the nature of political action itself. Politics, in his view, is fundamentally about managing the relationship between competing forces and interests, not about implementing abstract ideals in a vacuum. The political leader who loses sight of this fundamental truth, who becomes so focused on his vision of what should be that he loses touch with what actually is, inevitably finds himself overwhelmed by forces he failed to anticipate or understand. The surprising consequence of blind conviction, therefore, is not merely that it leads to political failure, but that it systematically undermines the very possibility of political wisdom. It creates a form of self-imposed ignorance that renders the leader incapable of learning from experience, adapting to changing circumstances, or recognizing the unintended consequences of his actions. In pursuing perfection through the implementation of absolute principles, he destroys the possibility of achieving genuine improvement through the patient work of practical reform. This analysis reveals the profound irony at the heart of idealistic politics. The more passionately a leader believes in his ability to transform the world according to his vision, the less capable he becomes of actually improving it. The conviction that one possesses absolute truth becomes a form of practical ignorance that blinds the leader to the complex realities he must navigate to achieve any meaningful change. Understanding this dynamic requires us to examine not merely the surface features of political conflict, but the deeper psychological and philosophical assumptions that shape how leaders understand their role and responsibilities. It demands that we look beyond the rhetoric of noble intentions to examine the actual mechanisms by which political action produces its effects. And it challenges us to develop more sophisticated ways of thinking about the relationship between moral conviction and practical wisdom in the exercise of power. The second part of our analysis must therefore explore the specific mechanisms by which blind convictions produce their destructive effects, examining how the internal logic of absolute certainty creates predictable patterns of political failure. Through careful examination of historical cases and theoretical principles, we can begin to understand not merely that blind convictions are dangerous, but precisely why and how they produce the catastrophic outcomes that Machiavelli observed with such clarity. The transformation of noble conviction into destructive fanaticism follows predictable patterns that Machiavelli identified through his careful study of political history. Like a physician studying the progression of a disease, he observed how certain symptoms inevitably lead to others, creating a cascade of effects that ultimately destroy both the leader and his cause. Understanding these patterns allows us to recognize the early warning signs of this political pathology and, perhaps, to develop strategies for preventing or mitigating its effects. The first mechanism by which blind convictions produce destructive consequences is through the systematic distortion of perception that occurs when a leader becomes convinced of his own infallibility. This distortion operates on multiple levels simultaneously, affecting not only how the leader interprets events as they unfold, but how he processes information, evaluates evidence, and makes decisions about future actions. Consider the case of Maximilien Robespierre, whose absolute conviction in the righteousness of the revolution led him to see enemies everywhere and to interpret every challenge to his authority as evidence of counter-revolutionary conspiracy. What began as genuine insight into the injustices of the old regime gradually transformed into a paranoid worldview in which any questioning of his methods was proof of treachery. His convictions created a lens through which all information was filtered, allowing only confirming evidence to reach his conscious awareness while automatically dismissing or reinterpreting anything that contradicted his beliefs. This selective perception creates a self-reinforcing cycle that Machiavelli recognized as one of the most dangerous features of political fanaticism. The leader's convictions lead him to take actions that generate resistance and opposition. This resistance is then interpreted as confirmation of the original beliefs that motivated the actions, leading to even more extreme measures. Each escalation produces greater resistance, which in turn seems to validate the leader's conviction that he is surrounded by enemies who can only be defeated through increasingly harsh methods. The psychological mechanisms underlying this dynamic are remarkably consistent across different historical periods and cultural contexts. The human mind's natural tendency toward confirmation bias becomes amplified by the stress and isolation that characterize positions of political leadership. When this tendency is combined with the intoxicating effects of power and the constant pressure to project confidence and certainty, it can create a complete disconnect from reality. Machiavelli observed that this disconnect manifests itself in several characteristic ways. The leader begins to interpret complexity as conspiracy, seeing coordinated opposition where there may be only the natural friction that occurs whenever anyone attempts to change established patterns. He begins to view compromise as betrayal, unable to recognize that political progress often requires accepting partial solutions rather than holding out for perfect ones. He begins to see dissent as disloyalty, creating an environment in which honest feedback becomes increasingly difficult to provide or receive. Perhaps most dangerously, the leader begins to view his own actions as inherently virtuous simply because they serve his declared goals, regardless of their actual effects on other people. This moral narcissism allows him to justify increasingly extreme measures by appealing to the nobility of his intentions while remaining blind to the suffering he causes. The gap between stated principles and actual behavior widens progressively, but the leader's convictions prevent him from recognizing this contradiction. The second major mechanism by which blind convictions produce destructive effects is through the creation of institutional structures that systematically suppress dissent and critical thinking. When a leader becomes convinced that he possesses unique insight into truth or justice, he inevitably begins to view those who disagree with him as either ignorant or malicious. This perception leads to the gradual elimination of independent voices from positions of influence and the creation of what we might today recognize as totalitarian institutions. This process typically begins with seemingly reasonable measures designed to ensure loyalty and maintain focus on the leader's mission. Advisors who consistently question the leader's judgment are replaced with those who demonstrate greater enthusiasm for his vision. Institutional procedures that might slow or complicate the implementation of his policies are streamlined or eliminated. Opposition voices are marginalized or silenced in the name of unity and effectiveness. Each of these measures appears justifiable when viewed in isolation, particularly when advocated by someone whose sincerity and good intentions are beyond question. The danger lies not in any single action, but in the cumulative effect of multiple changes that gradually transform the entire political environment. Over time, the leader becomes surrounded by people who tell him only what he wants to hear, while the mechanisms that might provide early warning of problems become inoperable. Machiavelli understood that this institutional transformation is not merely a byproduct of individual psychological failings, but a predictable consequence of the logic of absolute conviction itself. When a leader becomes convinced that he possesses unique access to truth, he must logically conclude that those who disagree with him are either misguided or malicious. If they are misguided, then they need to be educated or removed from positions where their ignorance might cause harm. If they are malicious, then they need to be neutralized to prevent them from sabotaging the leader's noble mission. This logic creates powerful incentives for conformity and sycophancy while systematically eliminating the kind of independent thinking that is essential for effective governance. The ironic result is that leaders who begin with the sincere intention of serving the common good end up creating institutional structures that make it impossible for them to understand what the common good actually requires. The third mechanism operates through the progressive escalation of methods that occurs when the leader's initial approaches fail to achieve their intended results. Since the leader's convictions prevent him from questioning his fundamental assumptions or goals, failure can only be explained by the inadequacy of his methods or the strength of his opposition. This leads to the adoption of increasingly extreme measures, each justified by the argument that the stakes are too high to permit half measures. This escalation follows a predictable pattern that Machiavelli observed in numerous historical cases. Initial failures are attributed to insufficient commitment or resources, leading to double-down efforts using the same basic approach. When these intensified efforts also fail, the leader concludes that his opponents are more numerous or more ruthless than he initially realized, justifying the use of harsher methods. Each escalation makes it more difficult to return to moderate approaches, both because extreme methods tend to create new enemies and because the leader's reputation becomes increasingly dependent on the vindication of his previous choices. The tragic irony of this dynamic is that the leader's absolute conviction in the righteousness of his cause often leads him to employ methods that contradict the very values he claims to serve. The revolutionary who begins by denouncing tyranny ends up becoming a tyrant himself. The reformer who starts by opposing corruption becomes corrupted by the very power he sought to use for noble purposes. The religious leader who preaches love and compassion ends up practicing hatred and cruelty against those who refuse to accept his message. Machiavelli recognized that this transformation is not simply a matter of individual moral weakness or hypocrisy. Rather, it reflects the internal logic of absolute conviction when applied to political action. The leader who believes that he is serving a transcendent good inevitably comes to view any opposition as evil that must be overcome by any means necessary. The conviction that his cause is just becomes a justification for increasingly unjust methods, while the belief that his goals are noble blinds him to the ignoble character of his actions. The fourth mechanism involves the creation of false urgency that prevents careful deliberation and encourages precipitous action. Leaders driven by absolute convictions often convince themselves that the problems they seek to address are so serious and the window for action so narrow that there is no time for the careful consideration that wise policymaking requires. This sense of urgency becomes a justification for bypassing normal procedures, ignoring opposition concerns, and implementing radical changes without adequate preparation or assessment of potential consequences. This false urgency is particularly dangerous because it contains an element of truth that makes it difficult to resist. Many of the problems that inspire political reform movements are indeed serious and do require prompt action. The error lies not in recognizing the need for action, but in the conviction that immediate implementation of radical solutions is preferable to the patient work of building consensus and developing sustainable approaches. Machiavelli understood that this impatience reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of political change itself. Lasting transformation, in his view, requires not merely the implementation of good policies, but the creation of conditions under which those policies can be sustained over time. This typically requires extensive consultation, compromise, and gradual implementation that allows people to adapt to new arrangements and develop investment in their success. The leader driven by absolute convictions, however, tends to view such careful processes as unnecessary delays that provide opportunities for his enemies to organize opposition. His certainty about the rightness of his vision makes it difficult for him to understand why anyone would need time to be convinced or why any compromise would be necessary. The result is often the implementation of policies that might theoretically be beneficial but that lack the popular support or institutional foundation necessary for their long-term success. The fifth and, perhaps most insidious mechanism operates through the corruption of language itself, as blind convictions lead to the systematic distortion of meaning in ways that make rational discourse increasingly difficult. When a leader becomes absolutely convinced of his own righteousness, he begins to use words not to communicate truth but to serve his cause. Language becomes a weapon rather than a tool for understanding, and the meaning of words becomes subordinated to their political utility. This linguistic corruption manifests itself in several characteristic ways that Machiavelli observed with remarkable prescience. Terms that once had clear meanings become elastic, stretched to cover whatever serves the leader's immediate needs. Complex situations are reduced to simple moral categories that obscure rather than illuminate their true nature. Opposition arguments are misrepresented to make them appear more extreme or unreasonable than they actually are. Most dangerously, the leader begins to believe his own rhetoric, losing the ability to distinguish between reality and the simplified version of reality that his propaganda creates. The consequence of this linguistic corruption extends far beyond mere political manipulation. When language itself becomes unreliable as a tool for understanding and communication, the entire basis for rational political discourse begins to break down. People on different sides of political debates find themselves literally unable to understand each other, not because they disagree about facts or values, but because they are using the same words to mean completely different things. This breakdown of communication makes compromise and consensus building nearly impossible, while creating conditions that favor increasingly extreme positions. When moderate voices cannot make themselves understood across the linguistic divide created by competing orthodoxies, political discourse becomes dominated by those whose convictions are strong enough to overcome the noise and confusion that characterize public debate. Machiavelli recognized that this dynamic represents one of the greatest threats to stable governance, as it destroys the shared understanding that makes collective decision-making possible. When citizens and leaders can no longer engage in meaningful dialogue about their common problems, the political system becomes vulnerable to whatever force is strong enough to impose its will through non-rational means. The cumulative effect of these 5 mechanisms creates what we might recognize today as a totalitarian dynamic, in which the leader's absolute convictions systematically destroy the conditions that make wise governance possible. The leader becomes isolated within a bubble of his own making, surrounded by sycophants and cut off from accurate information about the effects of his policies. The institutions that might provide checks on his power are corrupted or eliminated. The methods he employs become progressively more extreme and contradictory to his stated values. The sense of false urgency prevents careful consideration of alternatives or consequences. And the corruption of language makes rational discourse increasingly impossible. Understanding these mechanisms allows us to recognize the early warning signs of this political pathology and, perhaps, to develop strategies for preventing or mitigating its effects. More fundamentally, it reveals why Machiavelli placed such emphasis on the cultivation of political wisdom as opposed to moral virtue as traditionally understood. The leader who seeks to do good in the world must first understand the world as it actually exists, not as he believes it should exist. This requires a degree of intellectual humility and flexibility that is often incompatible with the kind of absolute conviction that tends to motivate political activism. The third and final part of our analysis must therefore examine the alternative that Machiavelli proposed, the cultivation of what he called prudence or practical wisdom as the foundation for effective and ethical political action. This involves understanding not merely the dangers of blind conviction, but the positive qualities that enable leaders to navigate the complexities of political life while remaining true to their deepest values and commitments. Machiavelli's conception of political wisdom differs fundamentally from the philosophical traditions that preceded him, particularly in its emphasis on adaptability rather than consistency, pragmatism rather than idealism, and results rather than intentions. This approach does not represent moral relativism or cynical opportunism, as his critics have often argued, but rather a sophisticated understanding of how moral principles can be effectively realized in the complex and often hostile environment of political action. The wise leader, in Machiavelli's conception, begins with a clear understanding of the gap between ideals and reality, between what should be and what is. Rather than allowing this gap to discourage him or drive him to desperate measures, he accepts it as the fundamental condition within which all political action must take place. This acceptance does not mean resignation or compromise of basic values, but rather recognition that the realization of those values requires careful attention to the means by which they can be effectively pursued. This perspective requires what we might call strategic humility, the recognition that even the most noble intentions can produce harmful results if they are pursued without adequate understanding of the context in which action takes place. The wise leader must therefore cultivate the ability to see himself and his actions from multiple perspectives, to anticipate unintended consequences, and to modify his approach when evidence suggests that his current methods are not achieving their intended goals. Such humility does not come naturally to most people, particularly those with the kind of strong moral convictions that typically motivate political engagement. The cultivation of this quality requires conscious effort and institutional support, as well as a fundamental reorientation in how we think about the relationship between virtue and effectiveness in political life. Instead of viewing compromise as corruption and flexibility as weakness, we must learn to see them as essential tools for achieving lasting positive change. The development of political wisdom also requires what Machiavelli called the ability to read situations accurately, to understand the various forces at play in any given context and to anticipate how different actions are likely to affect the balance of those forces. This skill cannot be learned from books alone but must be developed through experience and careful observation of how political dynamics actually work in practice. This experiential knowledge differs fundamentally from the kind of theoretical understanding that often motivates idealistic reform movements. While theory can provide valuable guidance about general principles and long-term goals, it cannot substitute for the practical wisdom that comes from understanding how those principles must be adapted to fit specific circumstances. The leader who attempts to implement theoretical solutions without adequate attention to practical constraints typically finds that his good intentions produce bad results. Perhaps most importantly, the cultivation of political wisdom requires the development of what might be called moral courage of a different kind, not the courage to stand firm in one's convictions regardless of consequences, but the courage to question those convictions when evidence suggests they may be leading to harmful outcomes. This latter form of courage is often more difficult to sustain because it requires the leader to acknowledge uncertainty and to accept responsibility for mistakes, rather than simply maintaining the purity of his principles. The wise leader must also develop the ability to distinguish between core values that cannot be compromised and tactical positions that can be modified as circumstances require. This distinction is often difficult to maintain in practice because political discourse tends to treat all positions as matters of fundamental principle. The leader who can maintain this distinction, however, gains enormous strategic flexibility while preserving his integrity and credibility. This approach requires sophisticated thinking about the relationship between means and ends that goes beyond the simple formulation that the ends justify the means. Rather than viewing means and ends as separate categories, the wise leader understands that they are intimately connected and that certain means inevitably shape the character of the ends they produce. The choice of methods therefore becomes not merely a tactical decision but a moral one that must be evaluated in terms of its long-term consequences for both the leader and the cause he serves. Understanding these relationships requires careful attention to the unintended consequences that flow from political action, particularly the ways in which the methods employed to achieve good outcomes can themselves create new problems or obstacles. The leader who employs deception to achieve a noble goal, for example, may find that he has undermined the trust that is essential for maintaining support for that goal over time. The reformer who uses authoritarian methods to implement democratic policies may discover that he has created institutions and expectations that make genuine democracy more difficult to achieve. Such considerations require the kind of long-term thinking that is often difficult to maintain in the face of immediate pressures and urgent problems. The wise leader must therefore develop the ability to hold multiple time horizons in mind simultaneously, considering not only the immediate effects of his actions but their implications for future possibilities and constraints. This temporal complexity adds another layer of difficulty to political decision-making but is essential for achieving outcomes that are both effective and sustainable. The cultivation of political wisdom also requires institutional arrangements that support rather than undermine the development of these qualities. Leaders need access to diverse perspectives and accurate information, protection from the pressures that encourage oversimplification and false certainty, and incentive structures that reward long-term effectiveness rather than short-term popularity. Creating such arrangements is itself a complex political challenge that requires the kind of wisdom it is designed to support. Machiavelli understood that the development of political wisdom is not merely an individual responsibility but a collective challenge that requires the participation of citizens, institutions, and cultural traditions. The quality of leadership in any society reflects not only the character of individual leaders but the expectations and constraints created by the broader political environment. Societies that consistently produce wise leadership are typically those that have developed cultural norms and institutional practices that encourage the development of practical wisdom while discouraging the kind of blind conviction that leads to destructive fanaticism. This insight suggests that the problem of blind conviction cannot be solved simply by exhorting individual leaders to be more humble or flexible. Rather, it requires systematic attention to the conditions that shape how leaders think about their roles and responsibilities, the information they receive about the effects of their actions, and the incentives they face for different kinds of behavior. Creating such conditions requires the kind of institutional design and cultural development that can only be achieved through sustained collective effort over extended periods of time. The alternative vision that emerges from this analysis is neither cynical nor idealistic but something more complex and potentially more hopeful. It recognizes that human beings are capable of achieving remarkable things through political action, but only when they approach that action with appropriate humility, wisdom, and attention to the complex relationships between intentions and outcomes. It suggests that the highest form of political virtue lies not in the purity of one's convictions but in the quality of one's judgment and the effectiveness of one's actions in actually improving the conditions of human life. This vision requires us to think differently about many of the categories that typically organize political discourse. Instead of dividing leaders into heroes and villains, idealists and cynics, we might learn to distinguish between those who possess the wisdom to navigate complexity effectively and those who are driven by convictions that blind them to that complexity. Instead of evaluating political actions primarily in terms of their conformity to abstract principles, we might focus more attention on their actual consequences for human welfare and political stability. Such a reorientation would not eliminate the importance of moral principles or reduce politics to mere power struggles, but it would place those principles within a more sophisticated understanding of how they can be effectively realized in practice. The goal would be to achieve better outcomes rather than simply to maintain moral purity, to serve the common good rather than to demonstrate one's own righteousness, and to build sustainable institutions rather than to implement perfect policies. The surprising consequences of blind convictions that Machiavelli identified with such clarity continue to manifest themselves in contemporary political life, suggesting that his insights remain as relevant today as they were in Renaissance Italy. The leaders who cause the greatest harm are often those whose intentions are most noble, while the policies that produce the most destructive results are frequently those that are pursued with the greatest moral certainty. Understanding these patterns does not require us to abandon our hopes for political improvement or to embrace cynical resignation, but it does challenge us to think more carefully about how those hopes can be realized in practice. The path forward suggested by Machiavellian analysis is neither easy nor obvious, but it offers the possibility of political action that is both effective and ethical, both principled and pragmatic. It requires the cultivation of qualities that are not always valued in contemporary political discourse: intellectual humility, practical wisdom, strategic thinking, and moral courage of a sophisticated kind. But the development of these qualities may be essential not only for avoiding the catastrophic failures that blind conviction tends to produce, but for achieving the kind of political progress that has always been the ultimate goal of those who seek to serve the common good. The lesson of Machiavelli's analysis is not that we should abandon our convictions or embrace moral relativism, but that we should hold our convictions with sufficient humility to allow them to be tested against experience and modified when experience suggests they are leading us astray. The surprising consequence of this approach may be that we achieve more of what we truly want by wanting it with less desperate intensity, and that we serve our deepest values more effectively by holding them with the kind of practical wisdom that Machiavelli identified as the highest form of political virtue. In the end, the choice between blind conviction and practical wisdom is not merely a strategic question but a fundamental orientation toward the nature of political life itself. Those who choose the path of wisdom accept the burden of uncertainty and complexity, the responsibility of careful judgment, and the challenge of acting effectively in a world that rarely conforms to their ideals. But, in accepting these burdens, they also accept the possibility of actually making that world better rather than simply maintaining the purity of their own consciences. It is a choice that every political actor must make, and one whose consequences extend far beyond the individual to shape the quality of political life for entire societies and generations. The surprising consequences of blind convictions continue to unfold around us, offering new evidence for truths that Machiavelli perceived with remarkable clarity more than 5 centuries ago. Whether we learn from these consequences or repeat them may depend on our willingness to embrace the kind of political wisdom that he advocated, humble enough to acknowledge uncertainty, flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, and committed enough to the common good to subordinate our own moral certainty to the patient work of actually improving the world in which we live.